Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're watching in the world. I'm Canan Bolal, Assistant Professor in the Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of Washington, and I'm excited to welcome you to our 11th annual Ladino Day event, Kantika, a Sephardic novel. Before we begin our program, the University of Washington wishes to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This event is supported by the Lucy Benveniste Kavesh Fund for Sephardic Studies and additionally made possible by our partnership with the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the support of UW departments, including history, linguistics, Middle Eastern languages and cultures, and Spanish and Portuguese studies, as well as the generosity of several local and international community organizations, including the Congregation Ezra Beserot, the Seattle Sephardic Network, the Sephardic Bikur Holim Congregation, Sephardic Heritage International, DC, and the Turkish American Cultural Association of Washington. Many of you are online in the audience today. On behalf of us all, I thank you for your generosity. Today's talk would also not be possible without the Strom Center staff who work every day to bring thought-provoking academic programming to new audiences. Those professionals include Brandon Goldman, Carl Schoonmaker, Grace Elizabeth D., Jenny McCollum, and Lee Fowler. In order to keep the focus on the presentation, attendees in the Zoom webinar do not have video and microphone enabled. The presentation today will be about 45 minutes, and after that, we will have an audience Q&A. I welcome you to submit your questions with the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And please stay till the end for a special and unprecedented announcement. Elizabeth Graver's fifth novel, Kantika, was inspired by her grandmother, Rebecca Baruch Levy, who was born into a Sephardic Jewish family in Istanbul, and whose life journey took her to Spain, Cuba, and New York. Kantika was named one of the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2023, one of NPR's Best Books of 2023. Some of you may be aware that I started teaching elementary and advanced Ladino courses at University of Washington last academic year. While exploring the essential grammar and the vocabulary of Ladino in my classes, I make an effort to emphasize the vitality of Sephardic culture, with a particular focus on highlighting Ladino's creative resilience in the face of diverse challenges. Additionally, I try to show various ways in which both the culture and language continue to thrive globally today. In this context, I believe Elizabeth Graver, through her book Kantika, not only introduces but unveils a new perspective. She not only illuminates the unique aspects that define Sephardic history and culture, but also delves into nuanced and sensitive subjects, including mental illness, infidelity, challenging and unhappy marriages, as well as issues related to sexuality and desire. These often overlooked or dismissed topics are approached by Graver with insight, which I believe will initiate conversations that are not only compelling, but also essential in fostering a deeper understanding of the Sephardic experience. It is now my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Graver and the Isaac Alhadeff Professor of Sephardic Studies, Devin Naar.
Great, thank you so much, Canan, for the introduction. And thank you to the staff and to all of our supporters who have made this our 11th Ladino Day possible. It's just thrilling to have a colleague in Canan rendering her really, I think, perhaps the only tenure track position in the entire American university system whose specific role is to advance the study of Ladino language and culture. So it's thrilling to have you as part of our team. And it's also thrilling to have Elizabeth Graver with us here today. You know, the context for Ladino Day, and Canan is alluding to this already, we've been celebrating it or hosting it each year around the time of the holiday of Hanukkah, because the idea is just as the oil of the candelabra in the temple, according to the story, lasted longer than everyone thought it would, so too is Ladino still here, and it's lasted a lot longer than people have suspected, and it exists in a variety of domains, and there's certainly plenty of interest in Ladino language and culture, as evidenced by the fact that we've got about 600 people register for today's event from all across the world. And so it's fitting to have Elizabeth Graver as our guest today, not only because of her status as an award-winning author, but also given the title of her book, Kantika, which is an English novel, but with a Ladino title. And it's perhaps, we could say, the most prominent of a series of accessible and acclaimed books that have come out in recent years that have elevated the stories of Sephardic Jews. I'm thinking of Sarah Abravias Stein's Family Papers, Michael Frank's 100 Saturdays, Josh Tuninga's new graphic novel, We Are Not Strangers, and Tom Haviv's A Flag of No Nation, which is a book of poetry based on oral histories with his own Sephardic grandmother from Istanbul. And it's so within this context that I'm thrilled to welcome Elizabeth. Que venga enhorabuena, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. It's really such a thrill to be here. You know, I think I mentioned this to you when we were planning this event, but the Strom Center and the archives and your work and the work of pretty much everybody you just mentioned, I don't know the graphic novel, but I have that book of poetry, I've just started it, has just led me down all these paths that led me to this book. So you all are doing amazing work, and it's really quite thrilling to get to, especially be in conversation with you, Devin, and I'm very grateful.
Well, we're happy that you're here so much. And, you know, maybe we can begin with your grandmother, because, you know, she's the central protagonist in many ways of the novel, and the story is inspired by her. Rebecca, a Sephardic Jewish woman from Istanbul. And you first took interest in your grandmother's story a number of years ago when you were 21, if I'm not mistaken. So could you tell us a little bit about who your grandmother was and what drew you to her story? And then maybe we're going to see a little snippet and hear a little bit of what your grandmother's voice was like.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this book has been a ridiculously long time coming in certain ways. So I'm 59 now, and the actual book took me almost a decade to write because, as I'm sure we will discuss today, I knew very little. I really had a huge amount to learn. But it's true that when I was 21, so in 1985, I taped my grandmother telling stories. I had grown up quite close to her in certain ways. I always kind of identified with her. She was very artistic. She was constantly making things. I actually put on my desk, you can see a little one of her, I think this was a lace silk dress that she made for her dowry, a baby dress. And so I grew up constantly with her drawing and painting and singing, not writing ever. She was not that comfortable in English, and she also just wasn't literary by nature in terms of writing things down, but she was an extremely good storyteller. So that interested me because I already wanted to be a writer, but I also was kind of confused by her. And that also interested me. I knew she was Jewish. She was very proud of being Jewish. And we would do things like, I was raised quite secular, but when I went to her house, we'd light Shabbat candles and she'd take me to her temple and things. But she was very differently Jewish than the other side of my family, which is Ashkenazi, where my grandma Rose kept kosher and ate totally different food and just was of a completely different culture and sensibility. So that confused me. It confused me that my grandmother would sometimes say she was Turkish and sometimes say she was Spanish. She never said she was Sephardic. She never said Ladino. It was just Spanish. And in fact, as you'll see, my family had this weird detour to Spain. Not even detour, so many of them stayed there. So given the fact that the dominant story of the Sephardic Jews is that they were expelled from Spain and dispersed if they weren't forced to convert or killed. That was a weird term, but I didn't know the dates or the history or quite how it all played out. So basically, I was very confused by her, very drawn to her. And I also had a sense at that stage that she was getting older. She would die in 1992. And one of the real gifts of this book, and I think I was onto it then, although I didn't know I would write a book, was these conversations. So I wanted to sit there and like look her in the eye with a tape recorder on, for her to understand that her story, she was not a known person, but that her story was important to me. And somehow in taping it, that made it it gave it a little gravitas or something. I mean, I remember she said, "What is this?" And I said, "Say your name." And she said, "Why you want me to say my name? Like you know my name." So she found the whole thing a little weird, but I did do it, and I ended up with these very short tapes now. I would have asked her thousands of more questions. So yeah, let's share the video because it has her voice, and I love her to get a word in. You know, her voice is very beautiful. I think you'll notice she's a good storyteller.
In 1925, after having moved from Istanbul to Barcelona, Rebecca married Luis Baruch. In 1928, he abandoned her and their 2 infant sons and returned to his home in northwest Turkey. Eventually, he summoned her, but she arrived to discover that he had died while she was on her way.
I got so scared and see women coming, people coming, they were coming. I say, Oro. I said, that was his niece name. Oro. I said, what are these people coming over here? He say, no, don't worry. He said, they'll tell you what is it coming. So when a woman came next to me, she sit down right next to me. She say, my sweet, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry what happened to you. Say, it happened to me the same thing. I was very young when I lost my husband. He say, it happens to me. What do you mean? He said, that I lost my husband? The way you talk? Don't talk to me like this. I was telling him. He say, yes, that's what happened. And all of a sudden I fainted and I went down and that's all. And I don't remember anything else.
So yeah, we really get a taste of her, sort of her character and her charisma in that story. You've commented about the novel and your relationship with your grandmother as kind of a duet. You know, you've also admitted that you're not a very good singer, apparently, while your grandmother was. Can you say a little bit more about why you consider the novel a duet?
Sure. Yeah, the performance thing is interesting in that she really was a performer. She would grab the mic and she would embarrass us when we were little. For me, writing is a way to communicate I get to sit right here, you know, much more quietly. But I do think that I had this feeling of making something with her because the tapes were what started it. And even more than that, you know, my mother, who I believe is here on this Zoom, used to say that I would say she was my muse. I always kind of have a sense of making things in concert with her in some ways. And she was extremely encouraging of me. So I used to draw and paint and sew. I was never much of a good sewer, and she was always kind of helping me make things. So I guess I had the feeling I always do not always, but I mostly do a lot of research for my novels, and other ones are also historical. In this case, it was deeply personal, and I was talking to someone sort of who's no longer there, but is still a presence in my life, is still part of my family, right? And also whose voice I had not only on the recordings, but in this weird way, kind of slipping past them. So coming out. So I almost had this feeling, even though the book's not in first person, that she was talking with me or through me, not in some sort of supernatural way, but because of the relationship we had, I think. And it felt right, partly because she was herself, I think, both characterologically and maybe partly because of the Sephardic context. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. A very shape-shifting and fluid and border-crossing person. You know, so she spoke many languages. We're going to talk, I think, later about some of the different photos, but she could dress as anything. She could make anything. She sometimes would pretend she made things and embroider Rebecca on them. We'd be like, this is from TJ Maxx, you know, it has a tag. But so she was a little slippery with the truth too. And in that way, which I hope I'm not in life, but I totally am as a fiction writer, right? Like I'm allowed to be. Which may be partly why I did write this as a novel, because that was kind of a question at times. Should I write it as nonfiction? But I did feel like it was not only a duet with her, but actually a conversation with, I interviewed 2 of my uncles, my mother, talked to historians, read historians, went places. Like this book has many, many voices in it. You know, if I were to highlight this is what I got from Devin's great book on Salonica. This is what I got from my Uncle David. It would be this crazy tapestry, and that felt appropriate for my grandmother, but she's the through thread. So in that way, I mean, duet is in a way not quite the right word, except that if I had to narrow it down to two people, it would be her and me,
Her and you, yeah. I mean, I think you've touched on a couple of really important ideas here around the sort of the multi-rooted status of your grandmother in a certain way, in different and between different kinds of cultures and languages, that also creates a kind of liminality or maybe ambiguity, like, is she over here, is she over here, that maybe is a little unsettling for people who are or social context, when people expect people, okay, well, you're in this category or in that category, you belong here or you belong there. Well, Rebecca, and perhaps that's symbolic of a broader thread in the Sephardic experience in the 20th century, is moving across some of those different categories. Of the languages that made up her polyglot world, obviously Ladino, or as she called it, Spanish, was a key one. And I was just very intrigued, and I was so profoundly touched that the title of the book is in Ladino. And as this is Ladino Day, can you tell us, how did you get away, in a certain sense, with writing an English language novel for a mainstream American public with a single word in Ladino as the title?
That's a great question. And I was so excited. I felt like I'd sort of jumped some hurdle. So I have an editor at Holt Metropolitan Books named Reva Hockerman, who's very wonderful. It was the first time we worked together. And we were talking about the title of the book because I hadn't settled on a title when it was accepted. I had a kind of holding one, but not Kantika. And I said to her, I have an idea for a title, but it's a bit weird. And she said, weird is good. And I thought, wow, because this is a big 5 New York house. I mean, it's a very wonderful imprint inside Holt that does kind of edgier books in certain ways, but still. And then she said, but we have to get it past the marketing people. And we have, it had to go through all these avenues. But eventually they liked it. And I kept kind of saying, well, there's Pachinko and there's Crick Crack, and naming other books, other wonderful books about migration. Crick Crack by Edwidge Danticat, who's originally from Haiti, and Pachinko by Minjin Lee. And I kept naming other books with words that for some readers would, like you, would land as familiar, but for others wouldn't. I wanted it for a whole bunch of reasons. I think it's a beautiful word. I love even how it looks, like just the K's, and I just think it's cool. I mean, I'm a very sound and kind of visuals are really important to me. I was a poet before I was a novelist. But I was also really interested in both its decipherability and indecipherability. So the fact that some people would understand what it meant immediately and think, wait, someone's written this story. There are, as you said, not, especially novels, there's hardly any. There's the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. There's a few others, but not very many novels about the Sephardic experience. So I wanted to speak to those readers, but I also was actually really interested in people not getting it. And kind of, because my book is so about being a language outsider or being an immigrant or having to come into a world and figure out what things mean and rely on things like cognate. So it sounds like contar or conticle. Like you can associate it, but you can't necessarily pin it down. It has those spiky K's. So all of that interested me. And I actually love how the cover has a kind of portal. So it's kind of like, come in, like, well, I'll land you. I'm not trying to alienate anyone or confuse them, like I translate most of the time, but it was really important to me, and also honestly challenging, because I don't really speak Ladino. I've learned a little, but to have that multilingual piece, because it's so central. And then of course Kantika means song, and the book, we talked already about duets, but the book is filled with song. My grandmother never stopped singing. I have her father singing, and her mother's, it begins with lullabies. And for me, even the language of it and the flow of sentences is musical. Like that I read aloud when I write, like the sound of it and the song of it is really important. And then as I began to learn more, partly since it came out, I did a great event. I'm sure you know Sarah Aresti, who does Ladino singing. So I did a wonderful event with her, and she was talking about Ladino songs, and how part of the reason they've endured, in her opinion, is because they're small, they're simple, and they're portable. And that when people migrate and have to leave so many things behind, this is something that can get passed in a religious context, in a lullaby context, in a kind of romance context. These little songs are packages, and you can take them. And the novel's filled with people hauling around seeds and little teeny things they can carry. But I loved that idea that music, and also that music can be powerful and understood in a certain way, even if you don't know the words, even if it's in another language. So those are some of the associations.
Well, I think that it's coming back to this question of decipherability and indecipherability in a certain sense, like your grandmother being legible and illegible in different contexts. Like Kantika is comprehensible to those who are initiated, they're already inside of the culture, and it's maybe you can sort of get a sense if you know Latin or some related languages, but there's a mystery and maybe an invitation there. And I think some of that question of legibility and illegibility and the question of classification is also reflected in the book as a whole, because, as you've already alluded to, you decided to write a novel, but it is a novel based on, like, I don't know, true experience and research, and you included archival family photos in a novel. So can you tell us a little bit about how you understand the genre of your novel? And I don't know, is it a novel or is it a novel? It's a,
Right. What do we do with our...
Right. And also tell us about the images, how you use images. Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a weird novel. And this is, again, why I really was lucky with my editor. I recently went to a talk a couple months ago by the writer Anne Barrest, whose book, The Postcard, is this very powerful Holocaust story. And she used the term vrai roman, so true novel. And I thought that's a really good term, because it's not autofiction. It's not about me, and it's genuinely fiction. But I do these weird things where I use photos, and I also, for many of the central characters, with the permission of any of those who were still living and I could ask, I use real names. So why did I do this? I think I did this partly for very personal reasons, kind of for myself and my family, because I love these people. I mean, I wasn't trying to write something that presented them in some kind of idealized way. There's plenty, they're all flawed. And, there were moments when I was even writing in ways where I thought, is my family going to be angry with me because I was going into some dark corners? But I did care that there were real people behind it. And I guess I was interested in the photos, inviting the reader to notice those themes, not to think like, is this true and is this not true, but that there's a story behind here that really happened. The history is incredibly important to me. That's why I am so grateful to people like you and Sarah Abrevaya-Stein and, Aaron Rodriguez, who I wrote to out of the blue and went back and forth patiently with me. He had no idea who I was, because it matters to me to get the big history right. And it actually matters to me to the extent that I can to get the family history right, because I feel like I'm trying to imagine something really fully. So the photos are also notable to me because my family saved them. Again, this question of you're schlepping around, you have these two children. My grandmother was a widowed single mother in her first marriage. She had to go on these incredible journeys to get places and to figure out her life. And then, in Spain, right after she left, there was the Spanish Civil War, and then there was the Holocaust. There were just so many things in the way of anything getting preserved, human beings, but also the past. And yet she kept all of these photos, and they're incredibly beautiful. They often have really interesting things on the back of them. I could find out, for example, the first photo in the book, which is of a family portrait of when Rebecca's really little. I could see from the seal on the back that it was taken by an Armenian photographer on the Grand Rue of Paris, which, given what was going to chillingly happen a few years later with the Armenian genocide, and also just in sort of glimpsing the cross-cultural nature of the early part of that century where they would go to this studio, was fascinating. So the photos we have here, one is Rebecca in Istanbul, and the other is her in Barcelona. I think just a year apart. I don't actually know the precise date of the first one because it's not dated, but the second one is. And I was fascinated by them for a bunch of reasons. One, she's just really gorgeous and has a really interesting gaze, I think. I mean, I love in the first one how she's kind of like, don't mess with me. You know, there's something really strong and interesting in her gaze. But I was also really interested in ways that really jibed with my sense of my grandmother and how different they were. So the first one, I assume she made both the outfits because she was an incredibly gifted dressmaker. And at this point, the family had lost almost all their money. They started out quite wealthy. But the first one, she's wearing this kind of folkloric, 't Roma. I don't totally know, but a very Eastern looking, rather beautiful outfit. And she's got her head covered in that way. And then in the second one, she looks extremely Western European, maybe French. And I invented a scene where I have her going out to look for a job in Barcelona, wearing this outfit as an effort to sort of prove that she can fit in and that they should hire her and that she's, you know, dignified and can work with the upper class. And in fact, the dressmakers that she goes to are like, they don't like her for a bunch of reasons. I won't give it away, but partly they're just like, you are way too well dressed. You know, you need to be less well dressed than our customers. They expect that of you. So she's trying really hard and she changes over and over. And I have so many photos that didn't even make it into the book of these wonderful performances she put on in her sisterhood in Queens with her lady friends there, where they're kicking up their legs in chorus lines or they're wearing parasols, and you know, so she was always changing, and I was really interested in that. And I was also interested in how the photos are deployed for all kinds of means. So you send a photo to someone when you're desperate for a husband because you're a single mother who's lost her first husband. A photo can get you into a country or get you denied. I have her passport photo with her signature. I have an incredible photo that did not make it into the book, to my sorrow, of her two boys dressed in US sailor suits. She had two children in Spain before her first husband died. And then she had an arranged marriage to my grandfather and left her kids in Spain to go to Cuba to meet him. But in this photo, her boys, who had never been to out of the U.S., out of Spain at that point, are wearing these little insignias that say U.S. So she sort of turned them into little U.S. citizens, I assume, to convince this man she wants to marry her that, you know, they'll come and they'll fit right in. And then on the back of that photo, it says in English, "There in Spain, my darlings." So there is misspelled because she just was learning English. And darlings is spelled with a New York accent, Dollings, you know, my darlings. So that broke my heart, you know, to picture she was separated from her kids for 9 months. And I was writing this when it's still happening, obviously. A lot of family separations were happening, people separated from their mothers. And the fact that she wrote it in English and that she misspelled it and that you could hear the accent and that she'd made them US sailor suits. So that's just one photo, and that one didn't even make it in.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, there's so many ways in which the photographs become important conduits for exploring that boundary between the history and the fiction, and also thinking about the biography of your grandmother and maybe the ways in which she was also involved in a process of performance and self-invention and reinvention in different places, different contexts, different audiences, and seemed to be quite savvy, maybe even too good at it in a certain sense. And you know, the truth is, though, that your grandmother, the character of your grandmother in the novel, is one of several important women in the story. And I want to take a moment to ask you a little bit more about that, and about the role that sort of the figure of the strong Sephardic Jewish woman, what role she plays in the story. And, you know, we might think about the novel on the surface as a kind of a tale of migration, but it also offers a running commentary on the place of women in society, and the gaze on the female body, questions of sexuality, as Janan alluded to, blended families, and also the question of how all of this is can be an embodied experience.
Yeah.
Because one of the other themes here that is also very special, and a number of commentators have pointed this out, is the attention and the delicacy with which you deal the question of disability. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about another one of the characters in the novel, Luna, who had cerebral palsy, and why is it important for you to include her in the novel? And who was she, the person, and how is she in the novel?
Sure. Thank you for asking that. I had a lot of choices because this was a pretty big family about whose point of view I would follow. And I will say I discarded a whole bunch of sections. I tried a lot of point of views that I didn't follow. I ended up, and I was nervous originally to write about Luna because I, like many other things, I was like, can I do justice to writing about someone living in her time with the particular disability that she had? But I eventually decided that I really wanted to try. So my Aunt Luna was my mother's half-sister, my grandmother's stepdaughter. When my grandmother had a second marriage, as I mentioned, she went to Spain for this arranged marriage with a man named Sam, who had been married to a childhood friend of hers who had died giving birth, and that baby had died, but there was a child who had survived before that named Luna, who was born very prematurely and had cerebral palsy. So my Rebecca in the novel arrives in America to live with her brand new husband, who she's married very quickly in order to get in. She can only get in, this is in 1934, through Cuba as his wife, because so many doors had shut at that point. And she arrives and finds this around 7-year-old child who's very, very loved by Sam and his mother and his sisters, but absolutely kind of coddled, but nobody has taught her to do anything. She can't walk, she's in diapers, her speech is incomprehensible, and everybody is kind of saying, this is a terrible thing, but we love her, and this is her fate. This is what happened. When she was born, they told us she would never walk, she would never talk. They wanted to send her to an institution. We said no. They adored her. Sam, particularly, in real life, my grandfather was deeply devoted to his daughter, Luna. But Rebecca arrives, and she had always said, my mother told me that growing up, her mother always said that she'd been designated a healer. And when I was reading about Sephardic culture, I read things that said that often one woman in each generation would get that designation and would be taught certain things. And my grandmother was incredibly good with her hands, very intuitive about bodies, very kind of gifted at healing in an untrained way, mostly untrained way. But anyway, she got there, saw this child, and was like, absolutely not. Like, of course she can use the bathroom. I'm going to get to work. And so I imagined things that I have some things in recordings from my grandmother telling me some of this, and I saw some of it play out even when I was around. This very complicated relationship where I think Rebecca sees the humanity of this child, desperately wants to help her, is also kind of like, I don't want to be, she has multiple children by this point. I don't want to be stuck taking care of her my whole life. And maybe because she's a stepchild, can kind of be a little bit tough lovish with her. So there's a lot of tension. Is she helping her? Is she hurting her? Taking her through exercises and things. In real life, Luna made incredible progress. She was an extraordinarily bright person. She died in 2007, so unfortunately before this book. But she was a lot like Rebecca in that they were feisty, passionate, whip smart, very shrewd. And yet Rebecca, as we've been discussing, could deploy surfaces in this way that was often a matter of survival, but was sometimes a matter of pleasure. She loved to be looked at. She loved to perform. And Luna couldn't at first, and lived in a very prejudiced world where her body was kind of hyper visible in ways that were mostly received with negative attention. So I was really interested in exploring that. And really interested. It mattered a lot to me to go inside Luna's point of view, to not just have Rebecca looking at her, but to have her looking at Rebecca. So there's one scene in the novel when Luna's having a really hard time in school with the other kids. She's very, very lonely. She has no friends. She goes to the public school. They've gotten her in because she can finally walk well enough to do the fire drills. And Rebecca keeps saying to her, "You're smart, you're funny, just let them see who you are underneath." And Luna, because I'm in her point of view, says, she never says I'm pretty. She's really pissed about that. And then she also says, thinks anyway, easy for you to say, let them see who I am underneath. You don't walk out the door without putting on lipstick and looking in the mirror, and every reflection you pass, you look at yourself. So there were ways in which the character of Rebecca, and I honestly, my grandmother too, a little bit narcissistic, a little bit kind of skating on surfaces. And so I was really interested in how it's a loving relationship, but it has these tensions where they can see each other and where they're both loving each other and pushing on each other in very intricate ways. And Luna is this child of immigrants in a very prejudiced world against disabled people. In real life, she was a pretty astonishing person. She, worked for the city of New York most of her life. She had a child. She had 2 marriages. In her retirement, she wrote for the Sun Sentinel in South Florida. And I managed to find a bunch of those articles. And some of them were about the disability community. Others were about Judaism or retirement. They were joyful. They were positive. And Luna was also really interested in me being a writer. So there too, I was like, am I trespassing, or am I honoring, or am I like, is it okay? But I went with it. And so the pictures we have here, I don't really know the context of the picture of Luna sitting in the field, but I was very interested in how she's posing, and she's very beautifully dressed, but she's sitting down and she's got, her hair's a mess. I identify more with her. Like, I'd be the one with like the feather up. And so she's not Rebecca. Like and yet she's trying, and probably her father, who adored her beyond measure, took the picture. And then I was really interested in how it mirrored this famous painting, Christina's World, by Andrew Wyeth. So in the novel, I telescope forward in time. Luna was quite cultured. She liked art, and have her see that painting. And that painting itself has a quite interesting story, but it is a painting of a woman with mobility issues who is staring up into the distance, but is unable to get up. And so I was really interested in just almost visually how those two things mirrored each other, and thinking about art and rendering of bodies and gaze and all the things you're talking about inside the Sephardic context, but also because they're just human experiences,
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like it's such an important piece, though, of the novel, to the way that you are able to try to honor the perspective that Luna might have brought to the world. And I think that that's a really important piece, which compounds all of the other kinds of experiences of being a little bit on the outside, or being an immigrant, being Sephardic, being Jewish, then being Sephardic, and then, the disability angle. These all seem to be kind of compounding. You alluded to the extensive research that you've done, or that you wound up doing, in order to prepare the novel. And you undertook numerous interviews, as you've alluded to, and you've also visited a bunch of different places. If I'm not mistaken, you went to all of the places that you mentioned: Istanbul, Barcelona, Havana, in Cuba. So could you tell us something about, your visit to one of these places, and something you discovered there that maybe shaped the way that you developed the story in the novel?
Sure. And I think, were we going to show a couple pictures? Yeah. So this was probably the most fun part of all my, I always have to do research because I'm very unsystematic, and I don't do it all at the beginning. It really is intersecting with the writing of the book. But I went to Turkey. I'd been there once before for a month and stayed with family, but the second that was in, I don't know, the late 80s, I think. But I went again in 2015, and unfortunately, my grandfather's cousin and his wife, she was too ill to see me. He had passed away, so I was kind of on my own. Although my French friend Aline, who's friends with your relative Joseph Naar, met me there. So I did things like go to the site of my grandmother's house. Again, I was very, very lucky. This is not true for a lot of people, to have things like addresses and little sketches. And my family had collected and saved things in a way that partly I realize this because I'm poking into my father's past now, is very unusual. I don't have anything like that on his side. But I knew that my grandmother lived on this street. I think it means, John, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the soup maker's fountain, that someone told me is what the Turkish is.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay, so I thought that was a great name of a street. And my grandmother used to tell me that she would look out her window to the Greek Orthodox school. And it was very interesting to see where they lived because I think they were fairly wealthy. They did not live in Balat at the bottom of the hill. They lived in a quite pluralistic neighborhood with mostly merchants and business people of different, Greek Orthodox and Armenian and Jewish and some Muslim at the top of the hill. So the social class stuff played out there. It was also very moving to me that what had been her home when I went was filled with Syrian refugee children. And to think about what that means, that like one person's home is another person's exile, and that the place itself is so imbued by one's relationship to it. And I kept the children were incredibly friendly. So I was talking to them and kind of playing with them. I love kids. And just thinking about how they weren't home, but she had been there. So the layers, even if they don't come into the book, they're just incredibly evocative for me. And while I was there, I went to I had jotted down the name. I'm trying to find it. I went to a place called the Orium Old Age Home, which was essentially a Jewish nursing home. And I'd written ahead and said, can I interview some people? I'm a writer. And the social worker there said, sure, I have 3 or 4 people you can talk to. I had my first conversation. It was very nice, but not revelatory. It was kind of a very elegant woman. I think we spoke French. I speak French, telling me things I already knew. So then we finished and I said, I'm ready for the next person. And the social worker said, no, we're done. And this is when like my kind of my sort of greedy, like investigative reporter side, I was like, we're not done. Like I am in Istanbul. Like, when am I coming back? So I cajoled and begged and, told her she promised. And she eventually produced another woman who started out seeming very rational. She spoke English. I think she had a MA from Harvard in economics, like a very elegant, educated person. And then when I told her a bit of my life story and my family story, and I said, my family moved, quote, back to Spain in the 1920s when there was this law that Jews could go back to Spain. Sephardic Jews, she said, that's a terrible idea. Didn't they know that Spain was cursed? And so I immediately perked up. And she proceeded to tell me this story as if it was truth that ended up in the book that I won't give away here, but that's very disturbing, about a Jewish couple that goes to Spain and discovers some terrible things. And the minute I heard it, I thought that's going in my book because it was so loaded and interesting and so evocative of how, at least for some people, this history had endured. There's all these kind of, I think, cliches about, the Jews kept the keys to their houses and everyone wants to go back. And this struck me as probably a truer relationship in certain ways. It's complicated.
This is the basement. This is the basement.
A basement story. Yeah.
Okay. Everybody, you got to go look when you're reading, if you haven't already. look for
But
the
I
basics.
needed to give that story to somebody. So there's a character in the book who's loosely based on my great grandfather's first wife. All I knew about her in real life was that she couldn't have children, that he divorced her, moved to England for 10 years in order to divorce her. And my grandmother said this woman used to sit in the window in their neighborhood, sit in her apartment and call out to my grandmother, who felt very guilty that she existed at all because this was her father's first wife who had no daughter. So I had these little bits of knowledge, but that's where I was really, really embroidering. And I gave her the story from this person.
Yeah. Wow. You also had some discoveries from archival research and a variety of different sources that you delved into. Can you tell us about, you had an unexpected film find, which is very unusual. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, this was quite amazing. So I had a fellowship at Brandeis at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, which was a women's studies Judaism place. And I was poking around and I found, really just looking for kind of atmosphere. How do I write about Spain and Jews in Spain in the 1920s? There's not that much. There was a very small population. And I found a film from 1929 that as I was watching it, I thought, I swear to God, that's my great grandfather and my grandmother and my uncles, because I'd seen a lot of photos. And I also knew that my great grandfather Alberto had been the caretaker of a little semi-hidden synagogue in Barcelona at the time, and that the family had lived there. So I found this tiny bit of this very, very strange film that it turns out was made by a man who later became a fascist and was trying at that moment to bring Sephardic Jews either back to Spain or get them to do kind of Spain's work in the former colonies, essentially get them to kind of work for the fading empire, and ended up eventually getting in touch with a wonderful historian named Michael Friedman at Carnegie Mellon, who's written a lot about this filmmaker and bringing the filmmaker into the book. But the first thing that happened was that my uncle David, who died in 2021, but was a key part of my writing of this book, I would go spend days with him and interview him outside of Chicago and call him with tons of questions because he was born in Spain and lived until his mid-90s and had an incredible memory and loved to talk to me. I sent him the clip of the film, and he called me back and said, "Holy cow, that's me." He's 2 years old in it. So I think we're going to show you a little bit, but he's a little tiny boy in 1929 walking across the screen.
There it is.
Yeah. So that's my great grandfather with the beret. That we don't know who that is. That's David. And my grandmother's in the coat. And my Uncle Al's the kid with the curly hair.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I think there are so few families that have footage, like video footage from the 1920s. I mean, that must have been really striking. How did it make it? Yeah, it made
well,
it.
It was first just amazing. And then when I started to learn more about the filmmaker, it was actually quite chilling because this was a man, the film is called Jews of the Spanish Homeland. And I know you've taught it, you know its context really well, but do you want to explain its context?
No, go ahead.
So super quickly, you're the historian, but it was used as a kind of neo-colonial move to say there are Jews out in the world who speak Spanish and we want them to be part of Spain, to view it as their homeland, but really only because Spain thought that would serve their needs in that moment. And there's something a little creepy about the film. It's a little kind of ethnographic, anthropological in its tone. Like there's, it says you can even note the true Sephardic features of this guy, and they show him in profile. We were just like, ugh. It's sort of racialized, and I don't know. It set me on edge even before I knew. At the same time that it's filled with all this incredible detail, so I was drinking it in. But then when I learned more about that moment in the 20s, which quite interestingly is mirrored in certain ways by a moment now, like my own daughter has applied for, and in an equally failed set of laws, I think, applied and been denied Spanish citizenship. it was really kind of set forth in a way as a kind of compensation for past atrocities, but that's not what it was at all. And when the tides turned, so did this filmmaker, and he literally became a fascist and tried to set up Hitler with Primo de Rivera, the leaders of Spain's sister. So you just had this feeling of these people being little pawns. And when I pictured that he was actually in there training the camera on my family, that was sort of astonishing. And then I had to imagine, what would they do? So I thought Rebecca would love it. She's like, oh my God, a camera, you know. But her father, who's a man I never met, my mother never met, I really had to imagine him, but he has a point of view in the book I thought would be suspicious, because he's older and he's smart, and she's smart too, but he's smart in a different way. And I have them play a very kind of calibrated game, Alberto and the filmmaker, around kind of who has access to what. And that was really interesting and really hard to figure out, to not have the history kind of tip. My editor actually had me cut a big chunk of that scene because I was having too much fun.
And unfortunately, we are approaching the end here. So I want to conclude with a final question. I feel like we could go on for a really long time, which is just so wonderful. Coming back to the question of the duet and the title, Kantika, what do you think your grandmother would have thought of the way in which you have depicted her? The real her, the fictionalized her, and then thinking across the generations, thinking across the thread of Sephardic culture in the other direction, what, if anything, do you think? You mentioned your daughter, would you like your children, or perhaps one day their progeny, to take away from the novel? Is there a message for them, for the future, an opportunity maybe to add one of your own heirs' voices to the song, to that duet, a trio or more?
That's so nice. Both my daughters, they're 21 and 23, and they're both actually really good writers. So we'll see. I don't know what my grandmother would think. I mean, I can't imagine. I'm sure she would find moments that didn't ring true to her, because it's my imagination in a lot of places. So there must be places where she'd think, that's not how it happened. But I do have some feeling, which I think the rest of my family shares, because I have a lot of cousins and a sister, and many people have been involved in reading this book and helping me with it, that she would applaud the project because she was so creative, and because she loved me, and also actually because she really liked attention. And also because I think her story was both one of great joy and resilience and kind of stamina, but also a lot of sorrow. And she used to say, no one knows what I had with everything. It was a sort of a refrain. So there was often a sense of her carrying these things. And that's partly why I did the interviews. Like, I want to know, tell me. But I do have some feeling, I hope I'm right, that she would appreciate the fact that I took it so seriously in a certain way, that I really tried. Like, I went to every French Catholic school. She went to French Catholic school. I went to all three of them to look for her names. Like, I was dogged. And I think I got that in certain ways from her. I've had a much easier life than she has, but something about that persistence, and about, she was both very creative and really wanted to get things right. So the back of her embroidery is perfect. She was very meticulous. And so I do feel that whatever practices she taught me and the way she lived her life, plus the gift that I have of actually being able to be an artist when she couldn't. She had 6 kids. They were quite, not poor, but really scrabbling for money in the US. She couldn't make that life. So it feels that I'm doing it a bit for her. In terms of my children, I had a great time with them. I took one daughter to Cuba on my research trip. My other daughter she got sort of the short end, but to Queens, where we had an incredible time going to my mom's old house. My mother was with me too. And it's now inhabited, at least it was a few years ago, by this very, very lovely, devout Muslim couple. It was Ramadan. So they said, we can't feed you, but we'd like to welcome you in. And we had an unbelievably lovely, moving time with them. They gave us vegetables. They had a wild garden, just like my grandmother had. I wrote a little essay for Tablet about this at one point. And at the end, the man said to me, I said, thank you for sharing this day and this time. And he said, we're all from Abraham. And it was just a really incredible moment of the kind of layers and connections. And they were very glad to know who had lived there before. And I was really glad my daughter was there for that. I'll just read you one little thing. My older daughter, of course, she texted me from the train when she finished my book, but she wrote me a couple sentences that I'll share that probably meant more to me than my beautiful New York Times review, which I also was really so happy about. But she said, I just finished Kantika. It's so, so beautiful and very special for me to be able to read. I'd love to talk to you more about it in person. It's really such a gift for me to be able to access heritage and history that I never really knew about and that otherwise would have been lost with my generation. And you do it in such an intimate, stunning way.
That's great.
I saved that text.
Yeah. I think after that, you don't need anything else after that.
That's it. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing all of your insights about the process and the novel and your family. It's been such a wonderful opportunity to have the occasion to speak with you about all of that. We have time just for a few questions, which I'm going to I'll share with you, Elizabeth, and then you can respond. Okay. So the first question relates to the following. The multi-rootedness of your grandmother is almost a metaphor or even maybe an archetype for diaspora Jews. Could her being, quote unquote, slippery with the truth be part of preventing the evil eye, the ojomal, the Ayn Hara, which was so important to her culture? That's an interesting one.
That's very interesting. I mean, I loved learning about all those sort of reversals that, you say your child's beautiful and you send it back and, all of that.
Right.
I don't know. I do think the slipperiness was partly a survival mechanism, and partly had kind of pleasure and magic attached to it. And the evil eye seems to have both those things too in certain ways, right? I mean, even maybe I'm idealizing it, but just that beautiful blue, the sort of the tactileness of it and the kind of, I don't actually remember her. There's more evil eye in the novel than I must say there was in my life as a child. I'm incredibly superstitious though. Like knock on wood. I mean, you could call it OCD or you could call it like Sephardic, I don't know what it is, but it's hard for me to say. I do also think, I mean, tell me what you think, Devin. It seems to me that some of her kind of hybridity probably came from the fact that she grew up multilingual, went to French Catholic school, lived in all these, like, it's kind of, a lot of it is just the access that you're getting to different shapes, right?
Right. Yeah. No, there may be a built-in kind of component to that in her social, and cultural environment that she may be brought and transformed with her along the way. I think that certainly makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm very interested in how that's both a gift and a sorrow, that it's both because you're never quite at home. You're never quite in Turkey. They were guests. They lived good lives for hundreds of years, but they were never quite at home. And yet there was all this wonderful hybridity and fluidity. All of that I just think is really, and in fact, the book of poetry you mentioned at the beginning seems to me to be exploring that in some interesting ways.
Right. Yes.
There's a lot of abundance and then there's a lot of lack.
Yes. Here's a question more about how you think about yourself as a result of the book. So one person writes that what you wrote in the novel evoked a lot of his own grandmother's life, which this person, Mark Greenspan, he's a rabbi here in Seattle, has been exploring. And he's wondering what it means to you in terms of your own identity. Do you think of yourself as Sephardic? Or, I don't know, do you think of yourself as Sephardic maybe now or differently? And if so, in what ways?
Probably I think of myself as a little more Sephardic. You know, it's the first book. It's not like I've spent my life exploring this, although it's always been there and my grandmother's always been a presence. And I, you know, I'm now exploring the Ashkenazi side of my family. So I think as with I'm reluctant to be one thing in many, many different ways. Like I feel like that's part of the reason I'm a fiction writer. I get to be many things, you know, and when I was writing a book about a New England Lowell textile mill girl, I felt a little bit like one of those too. I would have dreams that I was one. So I think, but I do think that this book has gotten me to think about, it's put me in much closer touch with my own past in ways that feel incredibly meaningful to me. What that means in the long term. It's also been really interesting in terms of Judaism, and that I grew up in a very, you know, my father wrote books about Jewish literature, but, you know, I grew up in a very Jewish household, but we very, very secular in Williamstown, Massachusetts, where there were like 6 Jews, you know. So I've been interested, and it's not like I've now run off to like join a synagogue, but I've been interested in kind of feeling the pull of some of these practices and rituals, and just thinking about what it means, what my relationship to them is in a slightly more active way, if that makes sense.
And another question here about the theme that you've mentioned, which is home. So, you know, if your grandmother didn't feel at home, maybe in Istanbul, and maybe not in Barcelona, and maybe not in the other places that she lived, where is why don't you think she felt at home in Istanbul? And if not, where was home for her? Did she have a home?
I mean, I think she actually may have felt at home in Istanbul, and I certainly imagined Alberto, her father, to feel quite at home there. I was very interested in reading your book about Salonika, about the question of, are you a Jew or are you an Ottoman Jew? Are you a, you know, and before I'd read your book, I'd imagined him as, he's an Ottoman Jew, like this. And my grandparents loved Turkey. They were very sad to have left Turkey. So I think if there was a home anywhere, it was there. But I do also think, even though I was sort of mocking the, you know, the keys taken away during the Inquisition, they also were very connected to Ladino and to Spanish and to Spanish. My grandmother danced with castanets and, you know, would get us little Spanish dancer outfits. So I think it was, again, incredibly hybrid. And she was very good at making a home anywhere. My grandfather had a much harder time, who was also from that community, from a very poor family and a much more wounded childhood. You know, his father had abandoned them and he had to drop out of school really early. He wasn't a talker. I don't think I could have gotten his full story, but for him, he was very conscious in America of being an immigrant and not fitting in. He didn't like having an accent. He made my mother stop speaking Ladino at age 5. My grandmother sort of couldn't care less. She was very happy, kind of. She would find her place, and always, again, with a little bit of loss. But I think home, in a way, it was in her body. It was in what she made. It was in her children and her family. It seemed more portable, and that was something, that kind of resilience was very moving and instructive to me. It kind of emerged. I started to understand it better over the course of the book, which is just, wherever you are, you kind of, it's your people. It's the people you hold close, and it's the things you make. And when she lost all her money, she discovered rummage sales, and she'd make other things. You know, like she was really, really good at kind of finding value and joy.
Great, that's wonderful. I mean, you've given us so much to think about, and hopefully for those who haven't yet read Kantika, will do that immediately, and those who have read it will return to it and continue to think and reflect on all of the questions and themes that the novel raises. There are a lot of other questions in the Q&A right now, but unfortunately we won't have time to get to them. We'll capture them for you, those so you can take
Okay, yeah, I want to see them. So
thank you. So thank you so very much for being
Thank you.
Don't go away just yet, because I do want to have the opportunity to refer to what Canan mentioned at the beginning, a special announcement right now. And for that announcement, I'd like to call upon my friend and colleague Ethan Marcus, who is the managing director of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America and one of our key co-sponsors for this event to share with us our new initiative. So hang on tight, and Ayten, welcome. And thank you once again, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Devin. It was a pleasure. I'm going to turn my camera off, I think, at this point. Yeah? Okay.
Ayten, are you with us?
Okay, Kef Haber, everyone. Thank you so much, Devin. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Hazak ubaruch, as we say, both in Hebrew and Ladino, to Devin, to Elizabeth, and all the wonderful, excellent conversation I've had today. So my name is Ayten Marcus. I am the managing director of La Hermandad Sephardic de America, the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic community in the United States, that, in fact, Devin Naar himself is a fifth-generation member of. His great-grandfather, Chacham Benjamin Naar, was, in fact, a founder of. We're very honored and privileged to be partners with the Sephardic Studies program at the University of Washington, as in many years, for this year's National Ladino Day, a virtual Ladino Day. And we're very proud to jointly announce a brand new Muestras con Sellas, Our Tales, a national Sephardic essay competition, a writing contest rooted in Sephardic reflection and identity. This is a major, major milestone for the Sephardic community in America. In fact, it's really the first essay contest of its kind. When speaking with my colleague Devin and talking about, looking towards the future in terms of what Sephardic writing looks like, what Sephardic scholarship looks like, we actually referenced the past a little bit. Back in the 1930s, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America launched its own essay contest for the small community based in New York originally. And in referencing that material, incredible material that came out of that, we recognized together jointly that it's time for new essays, new literature, new culture, new ideas to come out both from the community and the academy in terms of what we want to see the future of Sephardic life reflecting on the past, but also bringing it forward to a modern day. So we're very, very excited to announce this jointly together this year. So if I could get the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So the topic for this year, sorry, slide back. Sorry, you jumped a little ahead. Thank you so much. So the principle behind the essay competition is sharing an originally previously unpublished work of prose. It can be fictional or memoristic that gives voice to the Sephardic experience. This could be from someone's family background or heritage, someone's lived experience, some community heritage, their life stories, or beyond. This is really a large catchment area because this is the first of its kind, and we are very excited to learn and hear from what both our existing community, but our expanding community might have to contribute. And some of the details regarding the prizes, as well as the deadlines, and et cetera, material. So our top prizes, there are two categories, which is very exciting. One, student category, 18 plus, so university and beyond, as well as one general category, so beyond the academy to the general audience. Anyone can submit in that category. So the first winner in each category will receive a $1,000 prize, along with the runner-up in each category will receive a $500 prize. And each winner and runner-up will be featured in El Hermano Sephardic Brother, which is the Sephardic Brotherhood of America's quarterly print magazine. It's been in institution for over 75 years, which we're very proud is going digital very soon, as well as online on the website of the Sephardic Studies program at the University of Washington. So it will be shared far and wide, both in terms, again, in the academy, but also in the community, which we're very excited this is a joint project between both mediums. We have 6 incredible judges for this first year of our program. Elizabeth Graver, who needs no introduction, who is an incredible writer and author and professor of English at Boston College. Dr. Devin Naar, who again needs no introduction to our community, who's the incredible chair of the Sephardic Studies program at the University of Washington. Rabbi Mark D. Angel, who's the director of the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, famously so with the rabbi of Congregation Shereth Israel for more than 40 years. Dr. Ruth Behar, who's the professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan and an award-winning author focusing on the Sephardic experience, particularly out of Cuba, vis-a-vis Turkey. Myself, as managing director of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, and Dr. Jane Mushabak, who is the professor emerita of English at the City University of New York, and also an award-winning author through many forms of historical fiction on Ladino language and Sephardic culture. So all this being said, we are very excited. You can go now, find out more on our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com/essay competition. The deadline for submission is March 22, 2024. So you have a bit of time. I encourage you all to please go visit the website to learn more about our requirements and submission process. We are very, very excited to see what comes out of this. And as we say in Ladino, se quiera Dio, with God's help, we should have many more years of celebration of Ladino, of advancement of Ladino, advancement of Ladino language and literature, and many more years of Ladino days together. Arvemos, thank you all so much for having me today.
Great. Thank you so much, Ayten. And thank you all so much for joining us for this, our 11th Ladino Day. We encourage you to reach out to us if you have questions about the essay competition, the writing competition. We hope to see some wonderful, exciting, and inspiring submissions from you. Thank you very much. Merci mucho y al vernos. Bye-bye.